First, Pfizer, CIA, Facebook, and other elites secretly meet in D.C., corporate media silent. We grabbed this from Matt Agarist. The world's ruling elite met in secret last week. No press allowed in, no one interviewed about it, and Bilderberg didn't even register as a blip within the mainstream media's radar. I've got one blip, actually. As the media, of course, hypes gun control and abortion debates, almost like it's some weird ritual or something. Bankers, politicians, military leaders, and information controllers were discussing their plans for the world behind closed doors, again, with zero transparency. The 68th annual Bilderberg meeting, held in locations around the world throughout the years, kicked off last Thursday, very secretively, very seemingly suddenly, in Washington, D.C. Absolutely no press coverage, and they wrapped it up by Sunday the 5th. Again, allegedly. Despite a prestigious guest list of around 120 attendees who will arguably have more of a global influence than any of the selected officials we all get to yell and scream about. The meeting, of course, will escape any scrutiny in the MSM. The reason this meeting of the global elite manages to remain free of all this coverage is no accident, because the elite power brokers own that media. They own those politicians we cheer and jeer about, and they arguably own the world. In attendance to this year's meetings, James, again, we joke. We were just joking a few minutes ago. We talked about this before. We've indeed talked about this many, many times. In attendance to this year's meetings are war criminals like Henry Kissinger, Albert Edible Microchips Bourla, the CEO of the criminal pharmaceutical corporation known as Pfizer, head of the CIA, William J. Burns, Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, GlaxoSmithKline CEO, Emma Walmsley, Eric Schmidt, of course, the infamous former CEO of Google, and Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who this year, you might recall, ordered banks to freeze the accounts of Liberty protesters. Scotiabank did say they were sorry, though. It included, of course, other heads of corporate media, foreign heads of state, military officials, according to those elite group of power brokers made up of people who forced vaccines, lockdowns, and tyranny on the entire effing planet for the last 2 years. They're allegedly talking about these things: geopolitical realignments, NATO challenges, China, Indo-Pacific realignment, Sino-U.S. tech competition. You could probably collapse those last three into one things. Russia. By the way, continuity of government and the economy. Disruption of the global financial system. Disinformation being discussed by people behind closed doors with no scrutiny. Energy security, sustainability, post-pandemic health, fragmentation of democratic societies, trade and deglobalization, and, of course, that hot new single to hit the charts coming in at number 14, Ukraine, of course. Bilderberg Group meets in secret to discuss disinformation. But, James, I went to Gulag News. They have 7 articles. The Guardian, that's as big as it gets by far, but in their, I guess, defense, they do support it, probably because they used to have some guy that wrote for them that I'm sure they've long since fired. So they maybe feel somewhat maybe married to the coverage. After that, things I've never heard of, sorry. The Trumpet, Paradise News, People's World, the Westmeath Examiner, and, of course, Northeast Mississippi Daily Journal. Meanwhile, there are literally hundreds of stories on that same Gulag News about concerned citizen turned actor, governor wannabe who showed up to cry about guns at this week's White House press briefing variety show. Matthew McConaughey, that's right, tells the story of those killed in Uvalde, Texas, an emotional performative plea for action for the current thing at star-studded White House press briefing. James, I was joking on the morning show. It's like MTV's Total Request Live over there. Again, from the kids that wanted to bring dignity back to the Whitey House. From what I've seen, and I believe I heard that Burmas, again, this was announced and was found out at the last minute. I think the word from dudes like Jason Burmas was like, man, I couldn't have even made the 16-hour or whatever trip by the time the thing would have been done. Seems like Luke from We Are Change was the only dude out there in the District of Criminals trying to report on that so-called elite confab that dare not speaketh its name. James?
Well, James, great minds think alike, and apparently we do too, because I did the exact same search as you. I had the same experience as I think everyone, kind of caught off guard when this press release was suddenly out there and was being announced, and I thought, oh, I totally missed this. Sorry. We should have had this on New World Next Week last week, but now we're doing New World last week, I guess. But no, it's because they didn't put out the announcement until the meeting was already underway, and there was no pre-announcement or pre-speculation about this that I saw anywhere, even in the independent media. I did the same search as you did for mainstream coverage of this or anything that's showing up on the radar, and basically, yeah, the main article is the Guardian article from Charlie Skelton, who people will remember. They can go back in my archives. I've interviewed him a couple of times. He was the mainstream comedian who found out about Bilderberg and decided to cover it as a joke for MSM newspapers in England, and then found out it was very real. This isn't a joke, and has been one of the only people writing about this in anything approaching the mainstream for the last decade plus. This is kind of, in a way, just the whole coverage of this or non-coverage of this is indicative of Bilderberg as a whole. Remember back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, the old school truther days? Bilderberg was a huge deal, and everyone talked about it, and people were there and protesting and looking at the agenda and seeing who's driving in and out and all of this kind of stuff, and there was intel coming out from the inside. Now it's almost nothing. And you might have noticed they haven't had a Bilderberg meeting since 2019. So this is interesting. It has now managed to fly almost completely under the radar by essentially becoming public, in a sense, having bilderbergmeetings.org putting up their official, this is the agenda, and the official participant list, and it's probably mostly lies anyway, but whatever, it's all official. There's